You, girl, you need to leave this dining room immediately. This section is for our patrons, not for loitering staff. The words, sharp and cold as the tines of a sterling silver fork, sliced through the hushed elegance of Aria, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment. Genevieve Sterling, the restaurant's general manager, stood with her arms crossed, a severe silhouette in a perfectly tailored black dress. The afternoon sun, filtering through the panoramic windows that overlooked Central Park, caught the glint of her diamond earrings, but failed to warm the icy contempt in her eyes. Her voice, though not loud, was pitched to carry, a subtle instrument of public humiliation she had perfected over 2 decades of managing the whims of the ultra-wealthy. She was staring down at Ilara Vance, a 20-year-old waitress who was simply standing by a recently cleared table, taking a moment to catch her breath. The fine linen napkin in her hand was the only thing that betrayed her trembling. Ilara's uniform, a simple but crisp white shirt and black trousers, seemed a world away from the Chanel suits and Brioni jackets that populated the room. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, a regulation she despised but followed without complaint, and her young face, usually bright with a quiet optimism, was now pale with shock. The dining room of Aria was a cathedral of modern opulence. Marble floors gleamed under bespoke chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears. The chairs were upholstered in plush velvet, the color of crushed blueberries, and the air itself seemed to carry the scent of money. A complex bouquet of expensive perfume, aged leather, and the delicate aroma of truffle oil. Here, conversations were murmured, deals worth fortunes were sealed over seared scallops, and the clinking of wine glasses was the only acceptable form of applause. Ilara looked up at her manager, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Ms. Sterling, I was just waiting for the busser to reset the table. The Thorntons have a 2:30 reservation." Genevieve's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "Do not presume to tell me the reservation schedule, Miss Vance. Your job is to be invisible until you are needed, and then to be efficient. Lingering in the sightline of our clientele is unseemly. It suggests a lack of purpose, and here at Aria, we are all about purpose." To Genevieve Sterling, who was 55 and had clawed her way to this position from a much humbler background she never spoke of, appearances were everything. She believed the restaurant's 3 Michelin stars were maintained not just by the chef's genius, but by her own relentless curation of an atmosphere of flawless, unattainable perfection. To her, Ilara, with her worn but polished shoes and the faint shadow of worry that always seemed to lurk behind her eyes, was a discordant note in her carefully composed symphony. "Yes, Ms. Sterling. I'm sorry," Ilara murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to retreat to the bustling anonymity of the kitchen, her cheeks burning with shame. From a corner table, a man watched the exchange over the rim of a simple coffee cup. He was a regular, though one Genevieve paid little mind to. Mr. Julian Croft was in his late 60s, with a shock of unruly silver hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He dressed in comfortable, unassuming clothes, a cashmere sweater that had seen better days, well-worn corduroy trousers. He never ordered the most expensive items on the menu, never made a fuss, and always read a physical newspaper, a habit that marked him as an anachronism in this digital world. Genevieve had categorized him as a retired academic, or perhaps a moderately successful writer, someone with just enough old money to afford Aria as a weekly indulgence, but not enough to warrant her fawning attention. Ilara, however, treated Mr. Croft with the same gentle respect she afforded every guest. She remembered that he liked his coffee black and his water without ice. She knew he often paused his reading to stare out at the park, a look of profound melancholy on his face, and she had learned to refresh his cup without breaking his reverie. He, in turn, always looked her in the eye, called her by her name, and left a tip that was precisely, mathematically, 25% of his bill. Julian Croft saw the interaction between the manager and the young waitress, and a familiar frown creased his brow. He had built an empire on his ability to judge character, to see the gears turning behind people's eyes. In Genevieve Sterling, he saw a brittle insecurity masked by authoritarian cruelty. In Ilara Vance, he saw a quiet resilience and a dignity that her uniform could not conceal. He had been observing her for months, noting her preternatural awareness of the dining room's flow, the way she anticipated a patron's need before they even raised a finger. She possessed a grace under pressure that couldn't be taught. He folded his newspaper and took a slow sip of his coffee. The gears in his own mind were turning. Ilara's life outside the gilded cage of Aria was a constant grinding struggle. She was a student at Hunter College, trying to piece together a degree in art history, a passion that felt more like a foolish dream with each passing day. The bulk of her earnings went to the rent on a tiny fourth-floor walk-up in Queens that she shared with her grandmother Martha, a woman whose hands, once nimble enough to sew intricate quilts, were now gnarled and stiff with arthritis. The medical bills were a rising tide that threatened to drown them both. Every smile Ilara offered a patron at Aria, every polite nod, was weighed down by the knowledge that a single bad shift, a single missed payment, could send their fragile world crashing down. She possessed one small, peculiar talent she rarely spoke of. Ever since she was a child, she had an almost photographic memory for visual details. She could recall the exact pattern on a stranger's tie, the precise shade of a woman's lipstick, the unique scratch on a watch face she'd only glimpsed. She would sketch these details in a small notebook she kept hidden in her locker, a habit that helped her feel a sense of control, of order in a life that was otherwise chaotic. It was this eye for detail that made her an exceptional waitress, but it was a skill no one, least of all Ms. Sterling, recognized or valued. 2 days later, the tension in Aria was palpable. It was a Thursday evening, and the restaurant was preparing for its most important reservation of the year. The Vanderbilt family, titans of industry with a lineage stretching back to the Gilded Age, were dining at Aria. The occasion was a private dinner to celebrate a monumental merger, a deal that would be front-page news in the Wall Street Journal the next morning. For Genevieve Sterling, this was the ultimate test. A flawless evening would solidify her reputation as the city's premier restaurant manager. Any mistake would be catastrophic. "Vance," Genevieve's voice was a whip-crack in the pre-service briefing. "You will be assisting with the Vanderbilt table. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact for longer than is necessary. Your only function is to be a silent, efficient extension of the head waiter's will. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Ilara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Vanderbilts arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, a formidable quartet. There was the patriarch, a stern man with a face like a Roman coin. His wife, a woman so sculpted by surgery and draped in jewels that she barely seemed human. And their 2 adult children, a daughter who looked bored by her own existence, and a son, Preston, whose handsome face was marred by a petulant, arrogant smirk. From his corner table, Julian Croft watched them sweep in, a wave of entitlement that seemed to suck the very air from the room. He had dealings with the elder Vanderbilt, unpleasant ones. He knew the man's reputation for ruthless business practices and the son's for reckless, spoiled behavior. He ordered another coffee and settled in to observe. The dinner was an ordeal. The Vanderbilts were demanding, changing their orders, complaining about the temperature of the wine, and treating the staff with a casual disdain that was more insulting than outright anger. Ilara moved like a ghost around the table, refilling water glasses, placing and clearing plates with practiced, silent grace. She felt their eyes on her, not as a person, but as a moving object, a part of the decor. Preston Vanderbilt, in particular, seemed to enjoy making her uncomfortable. He would drop his napkin repeatedly, forcing her to bend down and retrieve it, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. At one point, as she was clearing his appetizer plate, he deliberately shifted his chair, bumping into her hard. "Watch where you're going," he sneered, though it was clearly his fault. "My apologies, sir," Ilara murmured, her face burning as she retreated. She noticed, with her artist's eye, the details of their table, the heavy, custom-monogrammed silverware, the baccarat crystal that refracted the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows, and the necklace around Mrs. Vanderbilt's neck. It was a legendary piece, known simply as the Vanderbilt Emerald. A single, massive, perfectly square-cut emerald, the color of a deep forest after rain, suspended from a delicate chain of platinum and diamonds. It was, Ilara knew from her art history classes, a piece of staggering value and historical significance. As the main course was being served, Mrs. Vanderbilt let out a piercing shriek that made the entire dining room fall silent. "My necklace, it's gone!" Her hand flew to her throat, where the pale skin was now bare. Panic erupted at the table. Mr. Vanderbilt stood up, his face a thundercloud. Genevieve Sterling was at their side in an instant, her face a mask of horrified concern. "Madam, are you certain?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course I'm certain, you fool," Mrs. Vanderbilt wailed. "It was here a moment ago. Someone has stolen it." Every eye in the room, it seemed, turned to the staff, and Genevieve Sterling's eyes, like two chips of ice, landed directly on Ilara. She had just cleared the soup course, the last person to have been in close proximity to Mrs. Vanderbilt. The accusation was unspoken, but it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. This couldn't be happening. "It must have fallen," the head waiter suggested, his voice shaking. Staff members immediately began to search the floor around the table, a frantic, quiet scramble on the plush carpet. But there was nothing. The Vanderbilt emerald had simply vanished. Mr. Vanderbilt's voice was low and menacing. "Sterling, I suggest you handle this, quietly and effectively. I want that necklace found, and I want the thief identified, now. Or I will not only ruin this restaurant, I will ruin you personally." Genevieve's professional mask hardened into something cruel. This disaster, this catastrophe, had to have a scapegoat, and she knew exactly who it would be. She turned to Ilara, her expression a mixture of triumph and fury. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice ringing with false authority, "you were the last person near Mrs. Vanderbilt. I think you have some explaining to do." In his corner, Julian Croft placed his coffee cup down with a soft, deliberate click. The play was over. It was time for the director to step onto the stage. The air in Aria crackled with a tension that was more suffocating than the scent of expensive perfume. The hushed murmurs of the other diners had ceased, replaced by a collective, voyeuristic stillness. Every patron was now a spectator in a drama far more compelling than any Broadway show. "Explain myself?" Ilara's voice was a fragile thread of sound. "Ms. Sterling, I didn't do anything. I just cleared the plates." Genevieve Sterling took a step closer, her presence looming over the much smaller waitress. She was performing now, not just for the Vanderbilts, but for the entire room, reasserting her control over a situation spiraling into chaos. "Oh, I'm sure that's all you did," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's simply a remarkable coincidence that a necklace worth more than this entire city block vanishes the very moment you lean over the table. A girl like you, I can only imagine the temptation." "A girl like me," Ilara repeated, the insult piercing through her shock. She felt a surge of defiance, a spark of anger in the cold sea of her fear. "A girl who works 60 hours a week while going to school. A girl who is trying to pay her grandmother's medical bills. That's the kind of girl I am, Miss Sterling." Mrs. Vanderbilt scoffed dramatically from her seat. "The sob story. How very predictable. They always have a sob story." Preston Vanderbilt leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Ilara squirm. Probably has it hidden in her pocket already. Planning to pawn it for a fraction of its worth. People of her class have no concept of true value. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing in on Ilara from all sides. She looked around the room, at the faces of the wealthy patrons staring at her. She saw suspicion, morbid curiosity, and in a few a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished. They were a jury that had already convicted her. "We need to call the police," Mr. Vanderbilt declared, pulling out his phone. "That won't be necessary, not yet," Genevieve interjected smoothly, seeing her chance to be the hero of the hour. "We can handle this internally. Security!" Two burly men in sharp suits materialized from the restaurant's entrance, their expressions grim. They flanked Ilara, their proximity an unspoken threat. "Miss Vance," Genevieve said, her voice now hard as steel, "you will turn out your pockets. Then you will accompany these gentlemen to my office, where we will conduct a more thorough search. If you refuse, we will assume your guilt, and the police will be notified that we have apprehended a thief." Ilara's mind was racing, a chaotic whirlwind of panic. Her grandmother, her job, her school, her entire future was about to be obliterated by a crime she didn't commit. She felt tears welling in her eyes, but blinked them back furiously. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I won't turn out my pockets in the middle of the dining room," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I have done nothing wrong. I am not a thief." And then, amidst the chaos, her brain did what it always did under pressure. It focused. It filtered out the noise and searched for details. The artist's eye, the curse of a photographic memory, began to sift through the events of the evening, replaying them frame by frame. The way Mrs. Vanderbilt had gestured with her hands, the angle of the light, the glint on the silverware. She remembered the moment Preston had bumped into her, his sneer, his dismissive tone. But she remembered something else too, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail. As he had settled back into his chair after the manufactured incident, his right hand had brushed against the heavy damask tablecloth. For a fraction of a second, as the cloth moved, she had seen a flash of brilliant, impossible green near the cuff of his trousers. It was there and gone in an instant, a detail so fleeting she had dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection from the emerald itself. But now it clicked into place, the deliberate bump, the sneer that was perhaps not just arrogance, but a mask for nervousness, the furtive movement of his hand. It was a wild, desperate theory, a shot in the dark against the word of one of the most powerful families in New York. To voice it would be professional suicide. They would call her insane, delusional, a liar trying to deflect blame. But what other choice did she have? "It wasn't me," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She looked not at Genevieve, but directly at the Vanderbilt patriarch. I think you should ask your son where the necklace is." The silence that followed was absolute. Then it was broken by a roar of laughter from Preston. "Me?" he guffawed, pointing a thumb at his own chest. "She's accusing me. This is rich. The little waitress thinks I stole my own mother's necklace. She's more pathetic than I thought." Genevieve's face contorted with rage. "That is enough. You will not make baseless, slanderous accusations against our guests. You are fired, Miss Vance. Security, remove her." The two guards moved forward, each taking one of Ilara's arms in a firm grip. Desperation clawed at her throat. It was over. She had failed. And then a new voice entered the fray. It was calm, measured, and carried an effortless authority that cut through the hysteria like a hot knife through butter. "I suggest you let the young lady go." Every head turned toward the corner table. Julian Croft was standing now. He had placed his newspaper neatly on the table beside his empty coffee cup. He wasn't a large man, but his presence seemed to fill the room, commanding an attention that the Vanderbilts, for all their wealth and bluster, could not. Genevieve Sterling stared at him, momentarily confused. "Sir, this is a private security matter. I must ask you to remain seated." Mr. Croft's stormy blue eyes fixed on her, and for the first time, Genevieve felt a genuine chill of fear. The look was not one of a customer, but of a judge about to pass sentence. "I am making it my matter, Genevieve," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that stunned her into silence. "You've made quite a spectacle this evening, and you've made a number of very poor assumptions." He turned his gaze to the Vanderbilt table. "Mr. Vanderbilt, we've met before. Croft Acquisitions, the telecom deal last spring. You tried to strong-arm my board. It didn't work." The color drained from Mr. Vanderbilt's face. He recognized him now. This wasn't some retired professor. This was Julian Croft, the Julian Croft. A legendary, semi-reclusive billionaire investor whose firm, Croft Holdings, had a portfolio so vast and diverse it was rumored to touch nearly every sector of the global economy. He was a kingmaker, a man who could build or destroy fortunes with a single phone call. "Croft," Vanderbilt stammered, I didn't realize—" "No," Croft said coolly. "You didn't. You were too busy enjoying the performance." His eyes then shifted to Ilara, who was still held by the guards, her expression a mask of bewildered hope. "I have been dining at this restaurant twice a week for the past 8 months. I have been observing your staff, and I can tell you that this young woman, Ilara, is the most competent, diligent, and honest employee you have. I have also been observing your son, Vanderbilt. He's been restless all evening, a bundle of nervous energy. And I too saw his little maneuver when he bumped into the waitress. He looked directly at Preston, whose arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a sickly pallor. "I believe Miss Vance's theory has merit. Preston, why don't you do us all a favor and stand up?" Slowly. Preston Vanderbilt was frozen in his chair, his eyes darting between his father and Julian Croft. He looked like a cornered animal. "This is absurd," he blustered, his voice cracking. "I'm not going to be ordered around by—" "Stand up, son," Mr. Vanderbilt commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The public humiliation was one thing, but crossing Julian Croft was a matter of financial survival. Trembling, Preston pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. And as he did, a flash of green and diamond fire caught the light. The Vanderbilt emerald, which had been caught in the cuff of his tailored trousers, dislodged and fell to the plush carpet with a soft, damning thud. The silence in the room was deafening. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air, all the sound, all the arrogance out of the Vanderbilts and Genevieve Sterling. Everyone stared at the magnificent jewel lying on the floor, a serpent of platinum and emerald that had just exposed a far uglier truth. Mrs. Vanderbilt let out a small, strangled gasp. Mr. Vanderbilt's face was a rigid mask of fury, his eyes boring into his son, not with a parent's disappointment, but with a predator's cold rage at having been exposed and weakened in front of a rival. Preston stood frozen, his face ashen, his carefully constructed world shattered in a single glittering moment. The would-be insurance scam, the cruel prank, the desperate act of a man-child drowning in debt and spite. Whatever his motive, it was now laid bare for all to see. But Julian Croft's attention was not on the Vanderbilts. His gaze was fixed on Genevieve Sterling. She stood as if turned to stone, her face a canvas of disbelief, horror, and the dawning, sickening realization of the magnitude of her miscalculation. The scapegoat she had chosen so eagerly had been exonerated in the most dramatic way possible, and she was left holding the blame for the entire catastrophic spectacle. "The first rule of hospitality, Genevieve," Mr. Croft said, his voice quiet but echoing in the tomb-like silence, "is to know your guests. But the first rule of management is to know your people. You have failed spectacularly on both counts." He walked slowly from his corner table, his unassuming posture now radiating an immense, indisputable power. He stopped in front of the two security guards who were still holding Ilara's arms, though their grip had gone slack with shock. "Let her go," he commanded. They obeyed instantly, stepping back as if he had an invisible aura. He looked at Ilara, whose face was streaked with silent tears. Not of fear anymore, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance before turning his full, icy attention back to the manager. "You publicly humiliated an innocent employee," he continued, his voice a clinical dissection of her failure. "You allowed your prejudice and your class-based assumptions to dictate your actions. You prioritized appeasing a guest, even a boorish one, over protecting your own staff. You created a hostile, toxic environment. And you did it all in front of a full dining room." Genevieve finally found her voice, a desperate, pleading whisper. "Mr. Croft, I had no idea. I was only trying to protect the restaurant's reputation." "Protect it?" Croft's laugh was a short, harsh sound, devoid of any humor. "You've shredded it. You've turned Aria into a stage for your own petty tyrannies. You are a liability this establishment can no longer afford." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "As of this moment, your employment is terminated. Pack your personal belongings from your office. Security will escort you from the premises. You are not to speak to any other member of the staff on your way out." The finality of his pronouncement was absolute. There was no appeal, no negotiation. Genevieve Sterling, the queen of this opulent castle, had been dethroned and exiled in less than a minute. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, the carefully constructed facade of her authority crumbling to dust. Mr. Croft then turned to the Vanderbilt table. The patriarch was already on his phone, no doubt speaking to a lawyer, a publicist, a crisis manager. He was trying to contain the fallout, but the bomb had already detonated. "Vanderbilt," Croft said, his tone dismissive, "get your family and your bauble and get out of my restaurant. Your account here is closed permanently." And if I read a single word in the press tomorrow that deviates from the truth of what happened here tonight, I will make it my personal mission to expose every dirty little secret in your portfolio. I believe you know I have the resources to do so." Without another word, the Vanderbilts gathered themselves, a shattered portrait of privilege. The father grabbed his son by the arm with bruising force, hissing something in his ear. The mother, clutching her reclaimed necklace, swept out of the restaurant with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much. They left a wake of stunned silence and the lingering scent of failure. The dining room slowly began to buzz again, but it was a different sound now. The excited, shocked whispers of people who knew they had just witnessed something legendary. They had seen a giant fall and a titan reveal himself. Julian Croft ignored them all. He walked over to Elara, who was standing alone, looking small and lost in the center of the vast, opulent room. "Are you all right, Elara?" he asked, his voice gentle now. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked at this man she had served coffee to for months, this quiet, unassuming regular, and tried to reconcile him with the force of nature she had just seen, command a room and dismantle lives with a few calm sentences. My restaurant?" she finally managed to whisper, latching onto the two words that made no sense. A faint smile touched Julian Croft's lips. "Yes. I suppose the secret is out. Croft Holdings acquired the parent company of the Aria Group 3 years ago. I find it's the best way to get an honest assessment of a business, to see it from the ground up, without anyone knowing who you are." He looked around the room, at the stunned staff, the whispering patrons. "It seems we are in need of new management, and a new philosophy." He turned his piercing gaze back to her. "But that is a problem for tomorrow. Tonight I think you've had enough excitement. Let me arrange a car to take you home." "My grandmother," Elara said, the thought cutting through her daze. "I need to get home to her." "Of course," he said. He gestured to the stunned headwaiter. "Have my driver brought around to the front entrance, and cancel the rest of my evening." As Elara was gently guided towards the exit, away from the scene of her nightmare and her vindication, she felt a profound, seismic shift in the foundation of her world. The ground beneath her feet, which had always felt so precarious, so ready to give way, suddenly felt solid. The future, which had been a terrifying fog of debt and uncertainty, now held a single, unfamiliar glint of light. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt something other than fear. She felt a sliver of hope. The ride home to Queens in the back of Julian Croft's Maybach was a surreal journey through a city that suddenly looked different. The familiar, gritty streets of her neighborhood, viewed through the tinted, soundproof windows of a car worth more than her entire apartment building, seemed like a landscape from another life. Elara sat stiffly on the buttery leather seat. The chaos of the evening replaying the journey home was a passage through a silent, shimmering dream. Elara sat perfectly still in the back of the Maybach. The city's neon chaos rendered a muted, painterly blur through the thick, tinted glass. The car moved with a profound quietness, an insulated world gliding through the raucous energy of Manhattan. It was the silence that was most unnerving. After the cacophony of the evening, the shriek, the accusations, the shattering of glass ceilings and careers, this hermetically sealed peace felt alien. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs for hours, had slowed to a heavy, painful thud. She kept seeing Genevieve Sterling's face, not the imperious mask of the manager, but the final shocking image of its complete collapse. The crumbling of certainty, the stark terror of a life's work undone in a single sentence. Elara felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. There was only a hollow, aching pity. Then the image would shift to Preston Vanderbilt, his arrogant smirk melting into the waxy, slack-jawed expression of a spoiled child caught in a lie too big for him to handle. And finally, her mind would land on Julian Croft, the quiet man from the corner table who had wielded his power with the calm, devastating precision of a surgeon. He had not raised his voice, he had simply rearranged reality. The driver, a man named Arthur with kind eyes she could see in the rearview mirror, said nothing. He seemed to understand that his passenger was in a delicate state of shock, a diver brought up from the depths too quickly. When the impossibly luxurious car finally whispered to a stop on the cracked asphalt of her street in Queens, the contrast was a physical jolt. The familiar brick facade of her building, the faint smell of fried onions from a neighbor's kitchen, the distant wail of a siren. It was her world, her reality, and it had never seemed so fragile or so far removed from the one she had just left. Arthur came around and opened her door, the gesture so formal it felt absurd on this humble street. "Mr. Croft asked me to give you this," he said, his voice a respectful murmur. He handed her a simple, heavy envelope of cream-colored cardstock. It had no name on it, only her own, written in a confident, angular script. "And he said to tell you he will be in touch tomorrow." Ilara's fingers felt numb as she took it. "Thank you, Arthur." The name came to her lips without thought. He offered a small, genuine smile. "You have a good night, Miss Vance." Climbing the 4 flights of stairs was an ascent back into her own life. Each creak of the worn wooden steps was a familiar note, grounding her. The air grew warmer, smelling of her grandmother's lavender sachets and old books. She unlocked the door to their small apartment and stepped inside, the lock clicking shut behind her with a sound of finality. It was like closing the cover on a bizarre and terrifying chapter of a book she never intended to read. Martha was asleep in her worn floral armchair, a book resting open on her lap, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. The soft lamplight carved deep, gentle lines into her face, a roadmap of a life of quiet resilience. A half-finished quilt, a vibrant constellation of colorful squares, was folded neatly in a basket beside her. For a moment, Ilara just stood there, watching her grandmother breathe. This was her anchor. This was the reason for the 60-hour work weeks, the exhaustion, the swallowing of pride. This small, peaceful woman was the entire world that Genevieve Sterling and the Vanderbilts had almost shattered. A wave of emotion, hot and overwhelming, washed over her. She knelt by the armchair and gently, so as not to wake her, took her grandmother's gnarled, arthritic hand in her own. The skin was paper-thin, the knuckles swollen, but the grip, even in sleep, was surprisingly strong. She rested her cheek against that hand, closed her eyes, and finally let the tears she had held back all night fall, silent and hot, onto the worn fabric of the chair. They were tears of relief, of fear, of a grief she couldn't name for an innocence she had just lost. "My dear girl," a soft voice murmured, "what on earth has happened?" Ilara looked up. Martha's eyes were open, filled not with alarm, but with a deep knowing concern. She had not been asleep after all. And so, in the quiet lamplit intimacy of their living room, the story spilled out of Ilara. Not the neat, summarized version, but the whole ugly, terrifying ordeal. The sting of Genevieve's words, the crawling shame under Preston's gaze, the suffocating weight of a room full of eyes convicting her, the heart-stopping moment when the emerald fell to the floor. She spoke until her voice was raw, until the adrenaline had finally burned itself out, leaving her feeling hollowed and strangely calm. Martha listened without interruption, her hand stroking Ilara's hair. When the story was finished, she was silent for a long time. "There are 2 kinds of people in this world, Ilara," she said finally, her voice raspy with age but clear as a bell. "Those who build their own castles, brick by brick, no matter how small, and those who can only feel tall by standing on the rubble of what others have built. You met both kinds tonight." She squeezed Ilara's hand. "I am so proud of the castle you are building. It is made of stronger stuff than any of theirs." Bolstered by her grandmother's simple, profound wisdom, Ilara remembered the envelope. She retrieved it from her bag and sat on the floor at Martha's feet, opening it under the warm glow of the lamp. Inside there was no letter, only a check and a business card. The card was stark and simple. Julian Croft, Chairman, Croft Holdings. Below it, a private number was handwritten in precise black ink. Then she looked at the check. The number of zeros made her vision swim. It was a sum so vast it felt like a fiction, an impossible figure that bore no relation to the world of rent payments and pharmacy bills she inhabited. It was enough to erase every debt, to soothe every financial fear, to buy them a future free from the constant grinding anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life. "My goodness," Martha whispered, peering over her glasses. Ilara stared at the slip of paper. Last night, she would have seen it as a miracle, a divine intervention. Tonight, she saw it with new, clearer eyes. It was a magnificent gesture. It was an apology from a man on behalf of a world that had wronged her. But it was also a conclusion. It was severance. It was a way to neatly tie off the messy affair, to pay for her silence and her suffering, and allow everyone to move on. It was an ending, and as she looked at it, a strange, fierce certainty rose up inside her. She did not want an ending, she wanted a beginning. The next morning, the city sunlight slicing through the blinds felt different, sharper. Ilara had barely slept, her mind a churning sea of possibilities. She made coffee, the familiar ritual a small comfort in a world that no longer felt familiar. At precisely 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She took a deep breath and answered. "Miss Vance, this is Julian Croft." The voice was exactly as she remembered it, calm, resonant, and devoid of artifice. "Mr. Croft," she replied, pleased that her own voice came out steady and clear. "Good morning. I trust Arthur saw you home safely." It was a statement, not a question. "He did. Thank you, and thank you for everything last night. You have no idea what your intervention meant." "I think I have some idea," he said. There was a pause. "I also trust you received the envelope." Here it was. The crossroads. "I did," Ilara said carefully, "and Mr. Croft, while I am more grateful for the sentiment than I can possibly say, I cannot accept it. It's far too much." There was another pause on the line, but this one felt different. It felt approving. "Think of it not as a gift, Ilara, but as a signing bonus," he replied, and she could hear the ghost of a smile in his tone. "I was hoping you would say that. I would like you to meet me this afternoon, at my office. I have a proposition for you that I believe you will find more interesting than a simple check." The Croft Holdings building was not a palace of marble and crystal like Aria. It was a blade of glass and steel that pierced the midtown sky, a monument to a different kind of power, quieter, more vast, and infinitely more potent. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalist design, all clean lines and muted tones. The air hummed with a low, purposeful energy. There were no fawning sycophants here, only focused individuals moving with an understated confidence. Ilara, dressed in her one good blazer and a pair of pressed trousers, felt her heart begin to pound again. But it was not the frantic beat of fear from last night. This was the thrum of anticipation, of standing on the precipice of something unknown and immense. Julian Croft's office was on the top floor. It was a vast space, but the view, a staggering, godlike panorama of the entire city, was the only ostentatious thing about it. The rest was a reflection of the man himself. The walls were lined not with abstract art, but with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with worn volumes on history, philosophy, art, and science. His desk was a large, unadorned slab of oak, holding only a sleek laptop, a single notepad, and a cup of coffee. He was not behind the desk, but was standing by the window, looking out at the city he so clearly commanded. He wore a simple grey cashmere sweater. "Ilara, thank you for coming," he said, turning to greet her. He gestured not to the formal chairs in front of the desk, but to a pair of comfortable leather armchairs in a corner near the bookshelves. "Please, can I get you anything? Coffee?" A genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that day. "Black, please. And a water, no ice?" He chuckled, a warm, rich sound. "Precisely. That is why you are here. Not because you remember my coffee order, but because of the mental architecture that allows you to do so. You don't just see, Ilara, you observe. You don't just hear, you listen. You process details, you find patterns, you anticipate needs. In your world, it makes you an exceptional waitress. In my world, it makes you a strategic asset." He sat opposite her, leaning forward with an intensity that made the vast room feel intimate. What happened at Aria last night was a symptom of a disease. A culture of fear, of prejudice, of valuing appearance over substance. Genevieve Sterling was not an anomaly. She was a product of a system that rewards bullies and overlooks true talent. I am in the process of dismantling that system throughout my organization. He paused, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. I am creating a new executive development program. It is not for MBAs from Harvard or Yale. They know how to read a spreadsheet, but they rarely know how to read a room. This program is for people like you, people with immense, untapped potential, people who possess what I consider the single most important quality in leadership: character. Ilara's mind was reeling. Mr. Croft, I'm a student of art history. I serve tables to pay my bills. I have no experience in business or management. Don't you? He countered gently. Every single day you manage a dozen competing interests. You diffuse the egos of demanding customers. You navigate the complex social dynamics of the kitchen and the front of house. You solve problems in real time with limited resources, all while maintaining a state of grace under extreme pressure. That is more practical management experience than most of my executives get in a decade. I can teach you finance in a month. I cannot teach a person to have integrity. The proposition was breathtaking in its scope. It was not a job. It was an apprenticeship, an education, a full-time salaried position within Croft Holdings. She would spend 2 years rotating through every key division of his hospitality empire: operations, finance, marketing, human resources. She would work alongside chefs and accountants, marketers and hotel managers. He would be her personal mentor. The salary he quoted was a number that made the check from last night seem almost trivial, because this came with something far more valuable: a future. At the end of the 2 years, he concluded, you will be qualified to run any one of my properties, including Aria. I want to give you the keys to the castle you were thrown out of. I want you to rebuild it, from the ground up, on a foundation of respect. Ilara looked from his earnest face to the sprawling city outside the window. It was a terrifying, exhilarating vista. The safe, predictable path of her life had just been obliterated, replaced by this terrifying, steep ascent. The whispers of doubt were loud in her mind. You're not good enough. You're a charity case, a pet project. She voiced her greatest fear. Why me? After this, won't people just see me as the girl from the Vanderbilt incident? The waitress the boss decided to save? Julian Croft's expression softened. Some will, he admitted. Let them. Your work will be your answer. Ilara, I did not save you last night. You saved yourself. You had the courage to speak the truth in the face of impossible odds. You had the observational skill to see the detail that cracked the case. I merely provided the platform for your voice to be heard. This is not charity. This is an investment. I am one of the best investors in the world, and I am telling you, I believe you are the single best investment I can make in the future of my company. She took the job. The next year was a blur of controlled, exhilarating chaos. Ilara learned the language of profit and loss statements and supply chain logistics with the same intensity she had once reserved for the study of Renaissance painters. She discovered that her artist's eye for detail translated seamlessly into spotting anomalies in inventory reports and identifying inefficiencies in hotel workflows. Her photographic memory, once a private quirk, became a powerful tool, allowing her to recall guest preferences, employee concerns, and contractual details with astonishing accuracy. It was not without its challenges. She encountered her share of skeptics, executives who saw her as Croft's folly. One, a slick regional manager in Chicago named David, tried to bury her in meaningless tasks, clearly resentful of her fast-tracked position. Instead of complaining, Ilara completed his tasks with flawless efficiency and then used her free time to shadow the hotel's housekeeping staff. She didn't just observe, she put on a uniform and worked alongside them for a day. She learned their names, saw the strain on their faces, and identified the root cause of the hotel's plummeting guest satisfaction scores. The staff was being forced to use cheap, ineffective cleaning products and worn-out linens to cut costs, a decision David had made to boost his quarterly numbers. Her report to Croft was a masterclass in compassionate analysis. It combined the hard data of guest complaints and budget lines with the human stories of the women cleaning the rooms. She didn't just identify a problem, she proposed a solution that included a budget reallocation for better supplies and a bonus structure for the housekeeping team tied to positive reviews. Croft implemented it. The hotel's scores turned around in 6 months. David was reassigned. Ilara had earned not just Croft's respect, but the grudging admiration of her sharpest critics. Exactly 1 year after that night, Ilara walked through the doors of Aria. The restaurant had undergone a subtle transformation. The opulent bones were the same, but the soul was different. The lighting was a little warmer, the space between tables a fraction more generous. The staff moved with a relaxed efficiency, an air of collaborative purpose, replacing the tense, fearful silence of Genevieve's reign. She was not there as a guest or a waitress. Her new title was General Manager. As she stood near the host stand, observing the rhythm of the room she now commanded, she saw a young busser, no older than she had been, accidentally knock a fork from a tray. It clattered onto the marble floor with a sound that, in the old Aria, would have been a death knell. The boy froze, his face flushing with panic, his eyes darting around for a sign of condemnation. Ilara walked over, not with a manager's stride, but with a quiet grace. She picked up the fork, and instead of handing it back to him, she met his terrified gaze. "It happens to everyone," she said, her voice low and calm. "My first week here, I spilled an entire tray of water glasses at table 7. You know what happened? Nothing. Because we're a team. Go get a fresh one. You're doing a great job tonight, Leo." The boy, Leo, stared at her, his shoulders visibly relaxing. A small, grateful smile touched his lips before he nodded and hurried off. From his old corner table, where he was dining quietly, Julian Croft watched the entire exchange. He didn't need to speak to his new general manager. He simply raised his coffee cup in a silent, profound toast. Ilara saw the gesture from across the room. She met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a smile of her own finally reaching her eyes. It was a smile of gratitude, yes, but it was also something more. It was a smile of ownership, of belonging. She looked around the beautiful, bustling room, at the guests, at her staff, at the city lights twinkling beyond the glass, and felt a deep, unshakable peace. She had not been rescued. She had not been given a fairy tale ending. She had been seen, and in the crucible of that terrible night, she had been forged into the architect of her own future, building her castle brick by brick on a foundation of her own making.